My name is Rob Gray, and I'm an orthopedic surgeon in private/academic practice in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And this is a version of a talk I gave at the 2014 Flatt Residents and Fellows Conference for the Hand Society called Why I Chose Private Practice. A little background on me: I used to be at the University of Miami as an attending after I finished my fellowship training. And I moved to Chicago for family reasons about 2 years after I took that first job. So this is really sort of what I learned and the differences between those two practice settings. The disclosures are, I'm still in the learning process myself. I expect to always be learning this, just like I'm always learning surgery. Much of this I learned from Bonnie Mason, who runs OPM. She's an orthopedic surgeon in Northwestern in Chicago. And she runs this conference called OPM. And if you have the chance to go, it's usually highly subsidized for residents and fellows. It's one of the best courses I've ever taken in any subject matter, and she's just a wizard. I may actually end up teaching for them later on, but I don't expect there to be any compensation, so I don't think that there's really a conflict there. So my practice in Miami was really a machete and AK-47 club. This is a copy of a list from a typical day, and I don't know if you can see projected on the screen, but the kinds of patients we had AK-47, septic wrist, free functional muscle transfer for brachial plexus injury, tire explosion, gunshots. So I think there's a meat grinder injury on there. So that's sort of the practice environment I was in, and it was awesome to begin with, and I still miss it, but I was wondering how much I would like it 10, 20, 30 years in. So that's part of the reason that I moved. But as I alluded to in the beginning, it was mostly for family and location reasons, and we'll get to that in a second. When I first came to University of Miami, one of my senior partners, Tom Temple, was interviewing me, and he was telling me about the differences between private and academics. And he said, Rob, in private practice, it's really one guy out trying to screw the other guy. But in academics, it's the other way around. So I say that to say that really, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, when you're doing orthopedic surgery, it's really kind of the same animal. We make a lot of to-do about the differences in these practice settings, but at the end of the day, it's all really pretty much the same. So the most important thing that you're going to look at when you're looking at one job versus another is the location. And in this talk, everything that's highlighted yellow is going to key you into what's going to be a determining factor in picking one practice setting over another. This house is actually about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from my own, and mine is slightly smaller than this. But the neighborhood where I live and practice is full of houses like this, miles and miles of streets with houses like this size, bigger, a little smaller. So there are a few things that one can expect when practicing in this circumstance. Number one is no more AK-47s and machetes. Number two, less Medicaid. It's a better payer mix. Number three, my kid is always going to be the poor kid in high school. He's going to live in the smallest house and have the worst car if he even gets a car. And that's not necessarily good or bad. It's got pluses and minuses to it like everything else, but it's an important thing to think about when you're looking at places. But the reason the location is really important is, where do you want to live? Where does your spouse want to live? Where do you want to raise kids? And that's really what got me out of Miami and back to Chicago. So when you're coming out of all this training, you're wondering, where are you going to go and what are your options? Well, there are tons of different kinds of jobs out there, and it's hard to break them up into a couple discrete categories because there's a lot of bleed through. And we do a lot of talking about academics versus private practice, but in reality, I think the more important distinction is an employed position versus a partnership. And so getting down to brass tacks, these numbers are made up. I picked them out of the air, but in general, this is sort of the trend line of an employed position versus a private position or a partnership position. And employed positions tend to start off with a higher salary, but cap out at a lower salary, whereas the private partnerships tend to start lower but have a much higher earning potential over time. Now, the slopes of these graphs vary widely from job to job. And as I said, these are fictional examples, but I do think they're representative. The thing that you really want to look at, though, is the area under the curve, because that's what's going to differentiate the earning potential in one job versus another. So employed jobs are structurally very similar to the jobs with which you're familiar: academic jobs, government jobs, the VA, things of that nature. It's a steady income. You get a W-2 paycheck, which makes it very easy to qualify for mortgages, but it's bad for taxes because your deductions go down. They tend to have greater fringe benefits and time off, things of that nature. Partnership, on the other hand, one has more control, but one needs more control. If you're going to run a partnership, you really have to tighten the screws on everything. An important difference in an employed position versus a private position: if you're in a 3-person group and there's a personality conflict, that's going to directly correlate to your paycheck in one way or another. Whereas in a large 4,000 physician organization, personality conflicts are never good, but they will probably have a little less impact on your take-home pay at the end of the day. Without question, the highest income potential in any of these jobs is going to be in a private partnership. So if you want to become the #1 best paid orthopedic surgeon in the history of the world, then you really don't need to listen any further. The common denominator between all of these jobs is that the money you collect minus the practice expenses equals your take-home pay. And that is constant no matter what the position is. So what are your collections? Your work is translated into CPT codes, and those CPT codes are worth RVUs. Your work RVUs are multiplied by some conversion factor, and that's payer dependent. So better insurance companies pay more per RVU. Your bill is subject to contractual adjustments, and that varies from job to job what those adjustments are. Someone has to service the billing and collections, and that also varies from job to job. If you're in solo practice, it's you doing those things. But you get a share of any of the ancillary income, and that really comes into private partnerships more than any sort of employed position, where the typically is not an option. Now, the dirty secret is that your collections may not actually be your collections. Depending on the partnership model, it could all be split equally among partners. No matter what you collect, everyone gets the same share. That's rare. It usually happens more for the ancillary income rather than the actual professional services component. Now, here's a look at some numbers. These are representative but not perfect. These are my first 10 months in my new job, and I just want to highlight your attention. My total charges for the first 10 months were a little over 1.8 million, and the net payment was a little over 565,000. There's still about 300,000 in accounts receivable, so the total number would be a little bit higher, but everyone's practice is different. The point of that is what you bill is a lot higher, many times higher than what you actually pull back in. So expenses. There are fixed expenses and there are variable expenses, and different practices have these in different ways, but fixed expenses tend to be divided equally among partners, whereas the variable expenses are allocated for each partner individually. But the expenses are really not that important. At the end of the day, every practice setting runs about a 50% overhead. A really great practice runs about 40%, kind of a not so great practice runs 53, 54%, but they're not going to vary too widely from that. And we spend a lot of energy focusing on these expenses when they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is the above the line number. How much money are you bringing in? Because the expenses are about the same regardless. So that refers to how much work are you doing, and that depends on the patient referral patterns, who's coming in the office to see you, whether the senior partners like to share or not, how many people are there in town that do what you do, and lastly, is there a captive primary care market? And that tends to be a differentiating factor. Some places have got a whole bunch of primary care physicians that refer only to them, some don't, and that can make one job a little different from another. Contract issues. Remember that everything is negotiable. Absolutely everything is negotiable. Now, the more The smaller the organization, the smaller the partnership, the more negotiable it is. If you're working for Kaiser or Mayo Clinic or Harvard, you're probably going to have a little less room to negotiate. But if it's you and one other person, you can negotiate pretty much everything, and you should. The smaller the entity, the more important the contract is. And if it's vital, you should get it in writing. But most things aren't vital, and I just want you to remember that most of the things that you're worked up about really don't matter that much. If you have a choice between a great partner and a great contract, you pick the great partner every time, because a jerk can make your life tough. I don't care what the contract reads. Now, the important part of the contract is you need to know your exit strategy. If you think you might want to work across town, you need to figure out a way to let that contract let you get out of it without having to write a check, and being able to work in a proximity to your current practice that is fitting for you. So why did I leave? What is the bottom line? Well, it really comes down to this graph. You want to ask yourself, what is my trend line? Where do I start? Where do I end? And what is the slope? So I started off, I thought I had an employed trend line sort of on this order, and it turned out it was a little bit more like this, which was a little less appealing. So I switched out for a different employed trend line, okay? Private practice or partnership groups want to tell you that this is sort of the slope you can expect. In reality, though, the average is more like this, which is still totally acceptable and totally not bad, but maybe a little bit different than what they're selling you. You just want to be on the lookout that you're not running into a slope like this. Okay, so in my private position, I still get to do some teaching. I volunteer at the OLC. I do arthroscopy courses, and I teach people hand surgery there. I chaired an ICL at the Hand Society this year. I'm planning on doing one next year. And I get fellow coverage from time to time. As far as research goes, I've got less pressure. I actually have more help to do research now than I ever did in academics, but I also have a lot less time to get the research done. I still do get some complex cases. For the most part, it's old ladies falling. It's not tire explosions so much anymore. It's much more cold trauma than hot trauma, which is a little bit better for my life. But I take Medicaid, and as long as you take Medicaid, you will always have complex cases because they won't be able to get treated anywhere else. I despise the term work-life balance, but I do have a more predictable schedule now. I think that if you're doing this job at all, you've won the lottery. You have a job where if you do this thing for 30 years and show up every day, you're going to help more people than you hurt, and your family is going to be well taken care of. So I don't really feel that the trade-offs of me being at work a lot are bad. But I traded my evenings for weekends, so I'm there later at work every day than I was when I was in academics, but I'm almost never there at all over the weekend. So why did I pick an employed position as opposed to a strict private partnership? It's a hedge against the ACA and some of the changes that are coming. I don't know what's happening. I don't think anyone really knows what's happening next. And I do think the employed groups offer a little bit better protection against uncertainties in the future. And I also don't love the brass tacks of running a practice, which are negotiating the prices of everything and your insurance contracts. It just wasn't my favorite part of private practice. So thank you for your attention. And I just wanted to highlight this website, whitecoatinvestor.com. This is probably the best thing that an emergency room doctor will ever do for you. It's a blog that a guy, I think he's in Arizona, does. It covers all sorts of issues, and I think it's important, and I would start reading it now. Thanks so much for your time.